seventh webinar in a series of webinars on the obligations of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, where we also provide you with practical tools and examples of how to actually meet these obligations. And I'm very happy that today we have quite a record participation. We have more than 800 registrations, slowly people joining in. I think we're not gonna wait for everybody to be there, because I'm gonna punish the ones that are on time. But thank you so much for joining us. As if you could move to the next slide. Just a couple of housekeeping rules. So you will all be muted. If you have any questions, please just drop them in the Q&A section, and we will address them during our 2 Q&A sessions later on. As usual, this webinar will be recorded. We will also share the recording and the slides with you afterwards. And then there will also be a brief satisfaction survey that we will share after. So just briefly on the agenda, what you can expect to get out of this webinar today. So starting off, I'll give you a brief introduction to the topic on purchasing practices, and also how Amfori addresses this and collaborates with other initiatives in this regard. Then we have Michaela Streibel from the Helpdesk in Business and Human Rights, who will speak to responsible purchasing practices in the context of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. Then we have Lisa Hör from the initiative Global Solidarity by the GIZ, who will speak on tools for responsible contracting. And then we have a Q&A session where we usually have quite a bit of engagement. So very much looking forward to your questions here, and feel free again to post them already during the Q&A. After that first Q&A session, we have Sven Buchholz, who's replacing Isabel Reichenbach from the German Partnership for Sustainable Textiles, as she just called in sick. Thank you so much, Sven, for stepping in on such short notice. Sven will present the common framework on responsible purchasing practices, which is a framework that was set up by various multi-stakeholder initiatives. And is currently in the learning implementation community. Then we have Anna Rückert from Hackro GmbH, really giving a business perspective on implementing responsible purchasing practices, also at the example of that common framework. And then we have another Q&A session and the closing by myself. So just on Amfori, I know we have a lot of participants also that are not Amfori members, or maybe do not know our organization so well. So I just want to give you a little bit of a recap. So we were founded in the 70s as a membership-led business association, and we're supporting our members in improving environmental, social, and governance performance of their value chains through collaboration and practical solutions and tools. We do that really for each due diligence step, from embedding to identifying risks, seizing, preventing, mitigating adverse impacts, tracking implementation, communicating about how you address them, and finally also remediating or collaborating in remediation. We have 2,400 members, or more than 2,400 members, multinational companies as well as SMEs. The majority are actually SMEs. In almost 50 countries. We cover 27 sectors, such as garments and textiles, general merchandise, household goods, electronics, cosmetics, toys, etc. And our main offices are based in Brussels, but we have a presence in 17 countries around the globe. This is mainly the key sourcing countries of our members on the one hand, so China, India, Bangladesh, Turkey, in Latin America, Argentina, and so on, but then also key member countries around the globe. Then we have, of course, a lot of monitoring offerings, audits and assessment. We have 30 monitoring partners that we work with. That includes, TÜV Rheinland, TÜV Nord, Elevate, and so on. And then we have around 40,000 audits and assessments per year. Our members use the sustainability platform of Amfori to map their supply chains, and through this we have around almost 60,000 production sites on the sustainability platform, And this really helps the members to identify synergies in terms of risk assessment and most importantly, continuous improvement. Also to really collaborate in their due diligence journey, create synergies and prevent duplication. And most importantly here, the focus of Amfori is on continuous improvement, so capacity building is another key pillar of our work. And last year we reached around 4,500 people through our free trainings that are free to the producers or the business partners of our members. I leave it at that. Maybe let me just very briefly give you an overview of the solutions we offer. Today we'll focus on Amfori BSCI. It's Amfori's social due diligence product. We also have an environmental counterpart, Amfori BEPI, environmental due diligence product of Amfori, and then our governance due diligence product, which includes Amfori Speak for Change, our supply chain grievance mechanism, as well as our ESG risk compass and our quality management initiative, QMI. Next slide. Okay, so let me just very quickly say why responsible purchasing practices is important. I mean, most of you are probably here because you see the importance and the relevance of it, but still I want to give you a quick glimpse as to what poor purchasing practices imply. They can result in higher worker turnover and lower productivity at the production sites. It can lead to poor quality products, delayed delivery, additional costs, and even industrial action. And of course, because of that, can also cause disruption and undermine a long-term security of the supply chain. Also, it calls into question companies' license to operate, particularly when it comes to or considering the fact that stakeholders are increasingly scrutinizing, companies when it comes to their social environmental footprint. Next slide, please. Now, the case for responsible purchasing practices. So why is this important? It can really help businesses to enable suppliers to pay workers fairly and invest in improving labor conditions. It also helps to reduce the risk of strikes and industrial unrest. It helps to protect and enhance corporate reputation, and of course also helps you become more competitive in the marketplace, considering that customers are increasingly tightening their sustainability requirements. And finally, and very importantly in this context of this webinar, it helps you to adhere to legislation such as the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, as well as the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. Fingers crossed, it's still going to be passed, this mandate. But then also, of course, the international guidelines, the UNGPs, the OECD due diligence guidelines, all of them mandate companies to identify, prevent, and mitigate adverse human rights impacts through an ongoing risk management process. And of course, purchasing practices in this regard are critical, especially when it comes to prevention. And I hope we can illustrate that in today's webinar. Next slide, please. So what does Amfori BSCI say on purchasing practices? So Amfori BSCI, there's a dedicated code of conduct. It's based on the international standards and guidelines, ILO fundamental principles, UNGPs, OECD guidelines, and so on. And out of these 13 performance areas, performance area 1 focuses on social management system and the cascade effect. Next slide, please. Now, we have almost 60,000 companies that have signed this code of conduct, and by signing this code of conduct, they commit to the social management system and cascade effect, meaning that they commit to train and incentivize all relevant departments and individuals in a manner that allows them to integrate the principles of responsible and gender responsive business and purchasing practices in company culture and cascade to their business partners. And also they commit to exercise responsible and gender responsive purchasing practices and to avoid putting their business partners in a position that prevents them from adhering to the Amfori BSCI code of conduct. This is very important because, of course, it gets to show that if you don't adopt responsible purchasing practices, you may jeopardize the social performance in all these other performance areas. So RPP is really critical and at the core of due diligence, which I hope we can show also later on. Next slide, please. We have the Amfori Speak for Change program, our supply chain grievance mechanism. It addresses grievances related to the Amfori VSA Code of Conduct, so also related to Performance Area 1, but also in the scope are any grievances related to the Amfori guidelines on RPP. And of course, in this context, the complainants, particularly being employers' organizations or other parties such as importers and producers, that's the main target audience pertaining to responsible purchasing practices or poor purchasing practices in this regard. And at the moment, we have this program running in Vietnam, in Turkey, in India, or certain parts of India, in Bangladesh, and then also coming up in April, Cambodia, in June, Pakistan, and in the second half of the year, we're also looking at China. Next slide, please. Just quickly on the guidance, I'm not going to go too much into detail here because we're going to cover this quite extensively in the next presentations. There's our RPP guidelines. There's a common framework on RPP that Amfori supported in its original setup in the first phase of the project before it entered the learning and implementation community, so in the drafting process. Then, of course, we're a member of the technical advisory group on the roadmap to living wages by IDH. In this context, there was also an action guide published that is available here. And it also gives you concrete examples as to how to adopt responsible purchasing practices. Now, very recently, an interesting publication by Fairware, also on a brand guidance on legal minimum wage increases. Why is this important in this context? Well, wage increases ultimately should, or at least minimum wage increases should be absorbed to an extent also by the buyers. So the labor cost is important to ring fence and not to negotiate based on prices. And of course, that's critical in the context of your purchasing practices. That's why I think this guidance with the recent wage increases in Bangladesh is very timely. It's a result of or response to a joint effort also from various MSIs, including Amfori, where we try to influence or advocate for higher wages and responsible purchasing practices in the context of the wage negotiations in the end of last year in Bangladesh. Next slide, please. Okay, I'll leave it at that. I hope I wasn't too long. I will move on now straight to Michaela Streibelt, who will really give you the ins and outs of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, specifically on purchasing practices. And then we have Felicia and the Q&A. So please, Michaela, floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks very much for having me and for hosting this webinar on responsible purchasing practices. I believe, responsible purchasing practices, and I'll explain this in a little bit later, really are at the crux of due diligence and also at the crux of the matter of companies' due diligence obligations under the German Supply Chain Act. Before I start with this, I'll quickly introduce the German Helpdesk on Business and Human Rights. It's a German government offer support service for businesses and business associations. And very quickly on the next slide, I'll give you a very brief overview over our different services. So our main focus is our free of charge and confidential advice. But we also offer training programs. You maybe can see that there's some links on this slide, and I believe these slides will be shared with you afterwards, so feel free to check them out. We help companies design their own training programs, but we also come into companies to train their staff, usually in customized training programs that we design together with the company. And we also have an e-learning program that's very accessible, rather basic, but a good introduction to get familiar with due diligence processes and business and human rights. Then we participate at events like today, but we also have our own events formats, an online seminar series, for example, but also in-person events in different setups, trying to foster dialogues with actors from different spheres. And we have quite a lot of online services by now, as everything else is also free of charge. Our SME Compass now consists of two components, the due diligence compass. That's a very hands-on, practical guidance for SMEs, but also for bigger companies, that leads you step by step through the process of implementing due diligence processes. Not really like, not only what is this, what you should be doing, but also what are the steps that will get you to design your own process. And the second component, the standards compass, helps you identify how to use standards in the due diligence process, recognize limitations, but also helps you compare different standards. Our CSR risk check helps with the abstract risk analysis. It's a good resource to find different resources. And then our tool, Business and Human Rights Navigator, highlights 10 special topics from the field of business and human rights, shows you how you can address them in the specific phase of the due diligence process, works as a glossary for other guidances of other organizations, and also features practical examples. Yes, so before I start with the actual topic, I'll also give you, I have a lot of things that I have to do before I start with the actual topic. I'm sorry for that. A quick overview over the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. I think a lot of this is familiar by now. I will not go into all of the details. So the Act obliges companies of a certain size to implement a risk management system. We like to break this down to 6 key elements: strategy and implementation, risk analysis, preventive and remedial measures, complaints procedure, effectiveness assessment, and reporting. And the due diligence obligations exist in the so-called supply chain, which is the upstream value chain. And the upstream value chain for this purpose is divided into 3 spheres in which companies have due diligence obligations: their own operations, direct and indirect suppliers. In relation to indirect suppliers, there needs to be a minimum threshold of knowledge. So the so-called substantiated knowledge to have obligations. And then it's important to note that the Act implements the due diligence obligations by their nature are duties of effort, not obligations to guarantee. That means that companies need to do their best to make sure that their supply chains are free of risks and violations, but they haven't necessarily guaranteed this success outside of their own operations, where they obviously have an obligation of guarantee. And the Act applies to companies of a certain size. This year, the threshold was lower to companies with at least 1,000 employees in Germany, and the Act only applies to German companies. So I'm now going to switch it around a bit to not say before I go into the actual subject matter, and I'll skip the next 2 slides, please. Sorry about that. Yes, next one. Yes. So why are purchasing practices so central to due diligence obligations? In the context of a German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, purchasing practices are part of the preventive measures. And in this context, they're listed in the Act among the presumptive examples, among the preventive measures that can be taken within the own operations, but obviously procurement strategies and purchasing practices aim at addressing risks and violations, not in the own operations, but actually towards suppliers. And purchasing practices and procurement strategies aren't only mentioned as the presumptive examples in the context of preventive measures, but are also highlighted across the explanatory memorandum from the German government with which they introduced the Act into Parliament. So the memorandum actually highlights that purchasing practices are key and center to companies' responsibilities in their supply chains. They're oftentimes reason to risks and violations, and they're one of the few things on which companies actually always have influence on. So even in contexts where companies have very little influence on what a supplier does, for example, their own behavior, and even that within limits of economic limits, for example, obviously, their purchasing practice is something that they can always use as a tool to change a situation. And the reason why purchasing practices are so central is not only in the context of preventive measures, but becomes even clearer when we look at the criteria of the Act that measures the threshold of due diligence, the criteria of effectiveness and appropriateness. And effectiveness and appropriateness, I've mentioned that the Act doesn't prescribe obligations of guarantee outside of the own operations, but duties of effort, duties of means. And these duties of means, effort, that don't mean that companies can just try in any way, but the shape of these duties is designed by effectiveness and appropriateness. And here again, purchasing practices come into play another time. So I'm going to ask you to skip forward 2 slides, please. I'm going to explain this in a little bit more detail. No, sorry, other direction, please. Yes, thanks so much. Sorry about that. So effectiveness and appropriateness, I'll quickly explain this. Effectiveness means that all actions companies take towards their due diligence obligations must be effective. This means they must make it possible that the action addresses risks and violations. So I've said it's a duty of means. It doesn't necessarily mean that the action must guarantee the result in the end, but it must at least be something that makes this result possible. And when we look at companies' own behavior, most importantly, purchasing practice, something like pricing, lead times, quality requirements, short-term changes, it's very difficult to envision effectiveness without actually looking for root causes for problems. And so it's very important that companies, when they look at how to address risks and violations in the context of preventive measures, where we're looking at risks, it's very difficult to envision an effective measure without actually looking at root causes. And also here, it's really important to not only look at root causes for problems that are outside of your own sphere of the company, but actually also look at own contributions to these problems, because effective action requires something that is not feasible for a company as well. And yeah, not always will it be possible to make a supplier do exactly what you want. And also usually it's not possible if you set a root cause to a risk or to any other to violations. It's very difficult to create an effective change without also addressing this root cause. So purchasing practices are not only presumptive example in the context of the preventive measures, but they are also oftentimes root causes, and therefore they give us information on what might possibly be an effective action to address a particular problem. This might not only be preventive measures. I know that this is where they're listed in the Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, but this might also even go further into remediation. And companies' effectiveness is always it's twofold criterion with which we measure the due diligence, or how we design the shape of the due diligence obligation: effectiveness and appropriateness. And purchasing practices are also not only important when we're looking at effectiveness, they're also important when looking at appropriateness. On the next slide, please. And appropriateness is a little bit more complex than effectiveness. I also always like to explain it in this order because it makes it a little bit easier, even though the Act actually doesn't talk about effective and appropriate due diligence, but actually appropriate and effective due diligence. And appropriateness consists of a couple of criteria. So you can see that on the slide: nature and extent of a company's activities, ability to influence, and then violation-related criteria: severity, reversibility, probability of occurrence, and the nature of the causal contribution. The criteria are understood as not standing in a particular hierarchy to one another. And companies need to consider them equally, but they're also in literature understood as playing a different role in relation to different due diligence obligations. And when we're looking at purchasing practices, they actually most importantly come into play in relation to the nature of the causal contribution, which also actually plays a role in relation to effectiveness, because if I don't know my own causal contribution, it might be very difficult to be effective, but also it might be inappropriate if I don't address my own contribution, because my due diligence measures are also assessed according to whether or not they terminate my own contributions to negative impacts that might have been created. So when companies are looking at how they can take action in their supply chains, and they fail to adjust their purchasing practices, fail to analyze and then accordingly adjust their purchasing practices, they might not be acting effectively, and they also might be acting inappropriately because they're not, they're not terminating their contributions. And to give you, this has all been very theoretic now, to give you a practical example, and this is something that I think is, this is a very easy one. Let's think about a context, and this is a practice that we see a lot in our advisory work. Let's say a company does a risk analysis, has discovered a couple of risks, and then their preventive measure is to send out a code of conduct to all the suppliers in which they shall guarantee that these types of risks and violations don't exist at their premises, or even further, not in their supply chain. This is something that companies do a lot, and at the same time, we see very little that companies are actually looking at their own purchasing practices. But if a company has actually created problems, and we've just heard from Francis that purchasing practices are very key when it comes to, for example, suppliers' ability to pay wages. It's also really important in relation to being able to make investments in the facility, for example, for operational safety and health, maybe environmental protections, and many other protected legal positions require sufficient funds to be implementing processes. And if the key reason is that the price that's being paid is insufficient, then you can have the nicest code of conduct in the world. It will not enable your supplier more to be paying proper wages, to be providing for good operational safety and health, for environmental protection, and so on. When looking a little bit more closely into what this all actually means in relation to how purchasing practices should be designed, and now you need to skip a couple of slides forward. Next one. What are we actually talking about? So for effective and appropriate due diligence, we need to look at, I've said it already, pricing. So I know that this is not a difficult discussion to have in a company, and I know from conversations that it's actually not really easy for companies to figure out how to determine what is actually a good price for a product, what is a price that covers direct, indirect labor costs, including costs for sustainability, living wages, and income. There's boundaries in competition law for companies on a horizontal level, so for competitors who are, for example, buying from in the same market or from the same supplier, to be discussing how they are creating their price, how much of the price is given for wages, how much is given for pre-products, for materials, and so on. So it's really difficult also for companies to be gaining knowledge or defining new processes, and it's unfortunately very rare that there's an open book price negotiation, but I really believe that this is something where we should be going towards too, because we really need more transparency in relation to what price is needed. There's also other problems in many contexts. We're talking about very competitive markets where maybe suppliers are offering prices to potential buyers that are insufficient to cover costs, and the buyer will not know that, and they will obviously go for the supplier that offers the best ratio between basically price, quality expectations, and maybe a lead time that meets their needs as well. So it's really difficult to now change into a new way of negotiating prices. But there's a couple of things that could be done. For example, offering to suppliers to renegotiate prices when there's an increase of costs, when there's a certain amount of inflation, when maybe union negotiated wages have increased. Lead times is something that can have a huge impact, positively and negatively, and is usually something that doesn't create considerable additional costs. So lead times should be designed in a way that accounts for the capacity of the supplier and human rights and environmental protection. There should be a right to refuse performance, and then subcontracting can be used as a tool to reduce the burden on a supplier, but obviously subcontracting should be combined with making sure that at the subcontractors level, there are no negative impacts created by subcontracting, or already existing negative impacts should be addressed. Short-term changes generally lead to negative or a risk for negative impacts. So this is something where companies should take a look at, not only short-term changes of lead times, but also short-term changes of product specifications, and generally like long-term working relationships are something that helps suppliers make necessary investments in their facility. Good wages, maybe they are able, when they have one good order, to increase the wage, but then workers might be expecting the higher wage in the future, even when there's no more orders coming in, or orders that are only paying for a lower price. And then using booked capacities, and then purchasing practices, procurement practices could be used also by incentivizing suppliers, good sustainability performance. So when a company wants to see certain improvements at a supplier's level, they could say, for example, okay, if you make these and that investments, and you, I don't know, install an environmental management system, we would be willing to then, give you a more long-term contract, or extend the cooperation with you. I see I'm already pretty much at the limit of my time. I want to show you one last thing. So if you could go 2 slides forward, and I want to say a few last words, no other direction, please. I'm so sorry, this became really confusing. Because I want to say a couple of words in relation to contracting, and I know that Felicia is going to go a little bit more in depth in relation to that. But I find it important to not only look at purchasing practices, but also look at contracting, because it's actually really key that commitments to purchasing practices go into the contract to make them enforceable. And in relation to contract design as well, I gave the example of having a fantastic code of conduct, but not increasing pricing, maybe leaving a supplier without means to actually fulfill their duties under the code of conduct. Also in relation to contracting, we need to look at appropriateness and effectiveness under the Supply Chain Act. And this is also the understanding of the competent authority with whom we co-authored and published guidance on collaboration in the supply chain, where we also highlight many of the things that I said in relation to purchasing practices. So oftentimes these contractual assurances are not effective. You might need to have to combine this with other preventive measures. And what's also really important is that the Act really prioritizes enabling suppliers before withdrawal, and sees terminating business relationships really only as a last resort. This because we know they don't really improve conditions at suppliers level, but also because termination rates that are too far reaching lead to negative incentives at suppliers level. And with that, I'm gonna hand over to you, Felicia.
Thank you, Micha. And I second the recommendation on reading the guidance for collaboration in the supply chain issued by BAFA and the German Helpdesk. It is a must read, it is really insightful, and it does contain a lot of information also on contracts, which is the topic I'm going to talk about today. Just briefly, I work for a GIZ project called Initiative for Global Solidarity. We work in HIEDD in the textile, electronic, and automotive sector. And we closely work with many MSIs as well as producer associations in 8 countries. So coming to the topic at hand, we have heard a lot about the role of purchasing practice and their stand in enabling suppliers for more sustainable processes and improved labor conditions. And this has been known for quite a while, and we see a lot of work in this topic. Now, the importance of contracts as the legal side to the buyer-supplier relation is increasingly coming into focus. As we see here, for example, as it is mentioned in the Common Framework for Responsible Purchasing Practices. And as Michaela mentioned, it is also referred to in the German law. In terms of contracts, what do? They signal to both parties how the relationship should be approached. And traditionally, they are used as a form of shifting responsibility from one party, mainly the stronger party, to the other weaker party. But there's also a more collaborative approach that is being developed now, where risks are shared, and this can have benefits to both parties. Michaela alluded to the example, but let me flesh it out a little bit. Traditional contracts often include termination clauses for anything but full adherence to zero tolerance requirements without a path for continuous improvement. This, given the nature of the supply chains that many of you work in, can be unrealistic. What it does is it gives the manufacturer an incentive to hide any risks or adverse HIDD impacts because of the fear of cancellation, because he would be in breach of contract. And this would lead to the risks the adverse impacts very possibly not being remedied. So these traditional contracts can lead to poor communication and lower transparency in the supply chain. On the next slides, we will take a look at some tools very briefly that you might use if you want to dive into this topic of shared responsibility contracting. Now, this depends slightly on the area that you're in because law is specific to the region. So if you're working within the US, you might want to look at the pan-industry clauses called the Model Contract Clauses 2.0, developed by a working group of the American Bar Association Business Law section and published in 2021. They are linked on the slide here. Similarly, currently in development are pan-industry clauses for European law, called the European Model Contract Clauses. And they have already been in consultation, and we really hope that they will be launched end of this year, next year. For the textile sector, and now we come to the next slide, we are very proud that we have an additional tool that has been developed lately and launched September last year. Let me give you a little bit of background on this tool called the Supplier Model Contract Clauses specific to the textile sector. Corona has shown the relevance of contracts for human rights and worker rights in supply chains. And due to the experiences with, for example, force majeure clauses, the Sustainable Terms of Trade Initiative is as a global manufacturer-driven initiative to create fairer purchasing practices. In 2021, wrote a white paper on the overarching problems in buyer-supplier relations. They made several recommendations, among them to work on contracts with manufacturers at the table. And this is what we did. So GIZ partnered with the Responsible Contracting Project to develop these clauses. And now the Supplier Model Contract Clauses are here. Let me note that they are also helpful for brands wanting to engage with manufacturers in a collaborative way and foster shared responsibility contracting that might also benefit them in the long term for more stable, more secure, and more open and realistic communication with their partners. On the next slide, there's an overview of the clauses included in the Supplier Model Contract Clauses. They are free to download in the nice red button above. I can also put the link in the chat later. They are 29 clauses in total, covering a variety of topics. Some are specific to the textile sector, for example, the one on sampling, but others are also applicable to other sectors. For example, the second one on HIDD responsibilities. They are free to use, they are modular, so you only use the ones that appeal to you. They can be adapted and should be adapted to specific circumstances by competent people, aka your lawyer team. And we encourage you to use them no matter if you are a brand or a manufacturer. I'm very cautious of time, so the next slide is an example. We will skip that. On the next slide, you can also see that I'm not a lawyer, many people are not lawyers. So for those who want to have an overview on shared responsibility contracting, but might not be into the weeds of the actual contract, let me recommend the framing memo, which explains the background of responsible contracting in a lighter way. And let me assure you that more support is currently being developed and will be rolled out soon. With that, I thank you very much for your showing up to this topic. And I hand back to Francis.
Thank you so much, Felicia. And I'm opening the floor for questions. We have quite a few in the chat, so also please keep them coming. Starting off, Michaela, that's a question to you. You are a lawyer, so you know also the ins and outs and the obligations of the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. And the question here is, how much of the German supply chain law obligations have been trickled down to other companies, smaller suppliers or global companies who supply to those who are included in the legislation? And maybe also from this angle of purchasing practices, what are the implications here? So that's the first question. You're muted.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And first of all, I mean, it's always good to know a lawyer and to speak to a lawyer. But generally speaking, I think one of the problems that companies experience is that we have this silo thinking, and people with legal training oftentimes in companies will enjoy more standing than, for example, people with a sustainability background. And this is actually one of the problems we need to start addressing. And I believe that even when you're not a lawyer, there's nothing wrong about that. You can be very great expert on the German Supply Chain Act, and probably people who don't have a legal background will have a lot more expertise in relation to business and human rights. That also has to do with human rights not really being very key in legal training, and business and human rights being a very new topic for legal practitioners. So yeah, to try to break down maybe this silo thinking, starting with your own head. When you're not a lawyer, don't hesitate to actually scrutinize what's given to you by your lawyer and really look diligently at contract clauses. They're written in a really boring way that doesn't make them very accessible. But when you're not a lawyer, you can understand them just as well with yeah, a little bit of thinking and a little bit of time. And actually, none of the obligations from the Supply Chain Act shall be trickled down. And I know this is a really, it's a little bit difficult to conceptualize this, because on the one hand, companies are not allowed to risk shift, but on the other hand, they're supposed to be creating changes in supply chains at their suppliers level. So obviously, this is also about kind of like interacting with their suppliers, and it's sometimes really difficult to find this sweet spot between, you know, wanting something from your supplier, but at the same time not being risk shifting. And this is why it is so important to be including responsible purchasing practices, and maybe even further things like providing training to your supplier, providing potentially financial assistance, capacity building, to not just risk shift, but combine what you're expecting with support to suppliers to be actually meeting these expectations. So it shouldn't be just a one-way street, but actually should go two ways, not only expectations against the suppliers, but also commitment from the obliged companies and how they will make their supplier able to meet these expectations. And this actually starts with addressing the own behavior of these companies. And everybody in business and human rights knows this is a no-brainer, but at the same time, it's also the elephant in the room. Purchasing practices are really the crux of the thing. Wages are too low because the price is insufficient. Environmental protection is not being taken care of because the funding isn't available. So yeah, I know I'm beating a dead horse, but we really couldn't highlight more how important this is.
Thanks so much, Michaela. Indeed, so it's a crucial aspect for due diligence, specifically on prevention, but I think you also showed earlier that in the context of remediation, that's also important in some cases. Okay, so next question, and I would ask you to keep it short and concise, considering that we have a bunch of questions and we don't have that much time for the Q&A. So next one relates to how do you actually show that your measures are effective when it comes to purchasing practices. You elaborated a little bit on the effectiveness of purchasing practices and how that looks like, but practically, if you could give an example or two.
Yes, I try to be short. I mean, effectiveness is one thing. Is from an ex ante, from a before perspective, companies should have like a theory, an idea of why they think this particular action will lead to the desired results. So companies should envision, when they're defining measures, what the desired result would be, and then have a concept of why they think this particular behavior will lead to the desired result. And this is from the before the measure perspective, ex ante and ex post after the measure. Companies are obliged under the Act to do an effectiveness assessment, to do this regularly, and then maybe adjust specific measures. So it should be a continuous process of improvement where you look at like, oh yeah, this is what I want to do, this is how it should be working, does it work, I'm going to change this. And in relation to purchasing practices with so many unknown factors, obviously it's going to be a trial and error if you're not coming into a situation where your supplier says, okay, here's all my books, this is how much I'm paying to my workers, this is my cost for this is my cost for that, this is what the material costs, this is the expected inflation in the next so and so many years. You don't have this information, and you, to a certain degree, and this is generally really difficult when it comes to effectiveness assessment. You need to start defining performance indicators and try to objectivize them, and not say like, oh, yeah, I have the feeling that things are better at my supplier, but actually look at like, what are my indicators? What do I want to see as really tangible results? But you're kind of operating in a situation of many unknowns, because you also, you will find it might be difficult for you to know what the situation is at your supplier at the start, and then it might be difficult for you to know how the situation changes after your intervention. And so this is where contracts come into play. You really need to build on a relationship of trust with your supplier, because if he thinks you're going to leave him for good, if he finds out how terrible things really are, how many problems he's facing, he's not going to be transparent with you. And you need to have a long-term relationship with them as well, because only then will they think, oh yeah, if you only make an order here, make an order there, that doesn't help you have this like trustful relationship to actually start working on things. So that's a good start. And there's a couple of things, we know that the results from questionnaires, but also from audits, are oftentimes flawed. So this is something that can be positively impacted also by working on a more transparent, more long-term, more trusting relationship with your supplier, I believe.
If I might add just one thing, the relationship obviously has two partners in it, like the brand and the manufacturer. And I believe the dialogue between the two of them is here essential also to ask, like, what is currently going on? How is the manufacturer perceiving that? Is that helpful? You can do that either through a variety of tools. There are structured surveys like the one that Better Buying offers, but it's also possible to do a dialogue. You don't have to always create your own surveys within the learning and implementation community for the common framework, which is upcoming in the next presentations. We really foster this shared dialogue, and this has created quite a few examples of little things that can be improved quite easily and that really help both partners.
Yeah, thank you, Felicia, for that addition. There's two questions here that I'm addressed at Amfori. I'll try to just quickly answer them. So one relates to an upcoming Belgium regulation on HRED. I'm not sure that's necessarily the focus. I think I also don't have the latest update in this regard, but I think what's important is that all the national governments are, of course, very much looking at what's happening at EU level, and then based on the decision in the council, there will probably be, they will decide how to take forward that proposal that came out in 2022. Then there's a question on also audits, of course, being one of the problems in a way, because they increase prices or they result in costs for producers. And here's a question as to whether Amfori intends to leverage partnerships with SEDEX, SLCP, and so on. Of course, Amfori in itself is already preventing audit duplication, since on average our audit reports are linked to I think 12 members or so. So it's one approach of preventing duplication, but then also, of course, we're looking at collaborating with different schemes to prevent audit duplication further. So that's definitely something on our mind. Now, when it comes to really the changes in business models, so that's one question here, Michaela, I think that's more pertaining to you. So there was a mentioning of minimizing negative impacts, for example, subcontracting. Mm-hmm. So how do you see the role of business models in this regard? For instance, not allowing subcontracting, what's the relation with, of course, short-term changes, because of course subcontracting is often a result of that. Is it to not allow it, or is it maybe to just see, okay, how is subcontracting resulting out of certain decisions in the purchasing teams?
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be both. It can either lead to negative impacts when either allowing your supplier to subcontract or create a situation in which he will subcontract anyways, whether he's allowed to do that or not. But also it can alleviate burdens and therefore prevent negative impacts. But at the supplier's level, then obviously you want to make sure what's happening at the subcontractor's level. So it's kind of subcontracting should be understood as something neutral that needs to be monitored really well. I believe when companies completely prohibit subcontracting and don't allow for example, exceptions, let's say the supplier should, tell the company who the subcontractor is so they can have a quick assessment whether they think there would be negative impacts or not. Then obviously this communication burden shouldn't be so high that the supplier is going to think like, well, I'm just going to do it because this is going to take until the end of time, or they want so much information I'm not able to provide it. So look at this is actually a sleek process, not too overly bureaucratic. Something that can actually be done by a supplier. Then subcontracting can be really, really helpful. So I know this is not really a one or yes, no answer, but be careful about this. If you completely prohibit it, they will probably do it anyways, but make sure what's happening at the subcontractor's stage. And you can, for example, if you put this in a code of conduct or contract, you can work with a rule exception clause, for example, saying that they're allowed to subcontract, they have to give you some information, but you reserve a veto right in case you see problems or you don't see your supplier sufficiently addressing problems to make it feasible. Yeah.
And then there's a question, I think, that addresses more you, Felicia. So there's a question about the contract clauses. So how realistic do you think that legal departments and companies are actually adopting such clauses? Do you have some practical examples of the adoption that you can reference already?
Yes, sure. I mean, yes, this is a recent topic, so the examples are scattered, but I think there are good examples. Siemens is a company that is a textile, Siemens is a company that is currently working on this and has been outspoken about it. I know that there are a couple of companies working behind the closed doors, so we cannot name them. Hapag-Lloyd is also interested in the topic and working on it. So a variety of sectors is currently, like, some of the leaders are engaging in that, I would say. And obviously, we hope to see more uptake.
Thanks.
Yeah, maybe I can just quickly add. I mean, contracts and code of conducts, you all know them by far most widely used tool by companies to implement due diligence processes in their supply chain. And also in the practice of the Helpdesk, contracts and code of conducts are our key topics with which companies approach us for our advisory services. So they're actually looking at, okay, now I really need to change and improve my practice. And they're really also looking out for, yeah, what are good examples? So good company examples, like the one like Felicia mentioned, but also like, do you have modular clauses? Is there something I can use? And you've heard her also talk about there being more modular clauses projects on the way. So I think really companies are hoping to change this, but are yet looking for guidance. But there's some guidance out there, and there's more coming.
I think we slowly have to come to a close. I'll give it like 2 or 3 more questions. Just there's one here on minimum wages. So what can you do as a brand exploring a new factory where minimum wage has recently changed to ensure the wage is being reflected in the pricing if you have no historic data to base it on? I think, Michaela, you emphasized the issue or the hope that open costing is gonna see a higher uptake. I think this is critical in this regard because, of course, you need a certain level of transparency to actually assess this. Of course, if it's a new factory, it's difficult to do, especially because open costing is something that is often happening when there's a very strong, close relationship for many years already. So it is tricky. I don't know if you have any insights on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's also difficult because you must factor in that the supplier might offer a price that's unreasonable because it's in a competitive market and they really want to get the order. And then also, you know, the company might think, well, but I only want them for this price, because if it would be higher, I'm not able or willing to pay that. And actually the price creation, what are the components, is actually outside of my sphere. So this is a really difficult one, something that companies could do to you know, you want your supplier, maybe after this signing of the contract, you want him to at least speak up about that and say, like, this price makes it difficult for me to pay wages. And you can, you know, put a couple of doors into your contract that at least allow for such a discourse. And this is really difficult when talking about companies like that, because they say, like, oh, well, all my suppliers are going to come forward and say, like, we need more money. And they don't want to commit on, you know, having every time there's inflation, the price goes up the exact same way, for example. But among German companies, for example, it's very common to have actually a complex mathematic formula in the contract. It's called price escalation clause. And with all the compounds of the prices, like when the union agreed wages go up by this and that much, you can calculate how much the price should be going up. This is probably the perfect way to do it. But you can just say, like, well, if you don't need to commit to paying more, maybe this exceeds your resources, but you could at least say, like, you are open to renegotiating the price with your supplier.
Yeah.
So that in the hope that they would then come forward. But keep in mind how long-term your contract is. If it's a short-term contract, they might just not do it because they want a renewal. So look at how all these aspects of purchasing practices, they're all interrelated.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Michaela. Okay, I would keep it at that. We have one more question that I would really like you to address, Michaela, because I think it's a very interesting one. And then I would propose we move on with our next presentation on the common framework, and then on a practical example from Akko. I think then we really get into the practical implementation. So many of your questions might also be answered there. In the meantime, Michaela, if you can try to answer the one and other question still in the chat, that would be great, like we've done in the past. But one last question I would like to address here is about also effectiveness and appropriateness. So is there any existing enforcement of the application of effectiveness and appropriateness? Some companies might be incentivized to take the easiest route, which often does not include addressing purchasing practices. Is this something that is actively assessed by the relevant authority, in this case, the BAFA, which certainly does enforce the German Supply Chain Due Diligence Act, also its effectiveness and appropriateness of measures, but maybe particularly elaborating here on RPP and, you know, how if you have examples of this.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any good examples. To my knowledge, they haven't yet done that, I think. I mean, we're very, very early stage. We need to keep this in mind. And when BAFA sees a problem, they usually give first an advice, then they order companies to implement specific measures, and only as a third step, they want to use the right to order sanctions. And I know that BAFA is currently asking two questions when they're investigating companies. They're asking, how is your management system implemented? And how is your grievance mechanism implemented? And then sometimes they react with, like, oh yeah, you need to make this and that change. But I haven't yet heard of them looking at purchasing practices or contracting. I believe they will in the future. And they have made very clear statements in our guidance. So it's possible that we might be seeing that, but it's just the beginning of the second year. So we need to wait a little bit longer.
Indeed, and I think it also, you know, gets to show that currently there is a lot of things happening also from the side of industry initiatives and companies in order to prepare for all these requirements. Maybe it's an informal grace period to kind of get up to par with certain matters, such as purchasing practices, because of course it's a very complex topic, especially when it comes to also enforcing it, monitoring its implementation, and so on. I would propose we move on. So next. Sorry, he will present the common framework on responsible purchasing practices. So Sven, floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. I'm standing in for my colleague Isabel. She got sick, so speedy recovery. I wish her from here. Good morning. So as already mentioned, I will present to you the common framework on responsible purchasing practices. I will refer to it in going onwards as just a common framework that's easier, I think. But before I do that, let me briefly introduce to you the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. So the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles is a multi-stakeholder initiative with almost 120 members from all walks of life in the textile industry. We aim to achieve social, ecological, and economic improvements across the entire supply chain in textiles. And now, since last year, we focus on 4 topics in the work of the initiative there. And one of them is about living wages and responsible purchasing practices, as these two, come in a tandem and needs to be tackled together. Next slide, please. So the responsible purchasing practices within the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. The members strive to improve their purchasing practices and to work towards living wages, or to that basically that living wages will be paid, since the members themselves are not really paying the wages. And the mutual basis for that is the common framework. And the common framework basically serves as an official frame of reference, as a reference point to improve the purchasing practices, and this on the basis of 5 principles. I will come to that a bit later. And it was already mentioned at the very beginning that there is a learning and implementation community that serves as a learning and exchange platform for partnership members, like from our partnerships, with other MSI members to actively implement the principles into their business activities. And after this presentation, Anna will, who's part of that group, then come to a little bit more beef to what I'm actually talking about here. And then there is also, I think Felicia is, said already about that, there is also the Initiative for Global Solidarity, which is also working on scaling the framework up to other sectors like electronic sectors and so on. And next slide, please. So coming to the common framework for responsible purchasing practices as a reference point, again, like as an MSI, the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles uses this framework as a reference point and supporting our members in improving their purchasing practices and also to increase the scope. And I think this is important. You will see now when we go through the different principles that there's duplication to what was said before. That has to do with the way the common framework was created, and trying to capture this complex field and these many moving parts, so that companies actually have some sort of guidance. And next slide, please. So there was an MSI, so multi-stakeholder initiative, a working group on responsible purchasing practices, and has collaborated to develop that framework. And by working on that and disseminating and promoting that to uptake and implement the framework, and then on influencing relevant policies through the participating companies. And the MSI working group writing the framework has included representatives of a lot of well-known initiatives and organizations like ETI, the Ethical Trade Norway, Fairware, Partnership of Sustainable Textiles, us in Germany, and the Dutch Agreement for Sustainable Garments, and also was then consulted by ACT, by Better Work, and as already mentioned by Amfori. And it is based on mapping of existing resources and builds on recommendations from the manufacturer's perspective by the Sustainable Terms of Trade initiative. And one of the activities established by the working group is the mentioned learning and implementation community, which is supporting the companies to improving purchasing practices. So, they're like these learning and implementation communities, not only with us here in Germany, but within all other participating MSIs. So, and what is important is this is not, the common framework is not a compliance tool or accountability mechanism. It is basically just a framework just to provide a common language to bring results and bring learnings better together. Next slide, please. So let me go through the principles quickly, as time is not on our side. As a result of mapping existing frameworks and documents, the group organized the recurring elements of what constitute responsible purchasing practices into 5 core principles that you can see here as an overview. So for each principle, the practices are presented in 2 stages, in groundwork practices and in progress practices, and to support a gradual stage implementation by the companies. And so that basically they can come in and whatever their starting point is. So I'm quickly going through all these principles now one by one. Next slide, please. So the first principle is integration and reporting. So in order to implement changes to purchasing practices, the company has top leaders to buy in and commitment. So these are the broken down principles here. It has a thorough understanding of existing suppliers and purchasing systems, and possibly understands the negative impact on human rights of their practices. And it uses this to decide on priorities that feed into an agreed improvement plan. So responsible purchasing practices are integrated into the commercial and other relevant departments of a business, ideally. And this includes integrating purchasing practice into strategy and decision-making processes, and establishing external reporting, as well as internal KPIs and of some sort of accountability mechanisms, and of course of training. Next slide, please. The second principle is equal partnership. So the purchasing company and the suppliers should respect each other as equal business partners. This was already also mentioned earlier, as most of what I'm saying here is as part of the common framework. And they should be eager and respectful sourcing dialogue and pursue win-win situations with a shared responsibility. This includes building long-term, secure sourcing relationships, reducing the churn of supplies, and formulating agreements on mutual responsibilities. Yeah, we have already mentioned the force majeure clauses and so on. Next slide. Collaborative production planning. Critical path and production planning is done collaboratively between the purchasing company and the supplier. Again, this was already also mentioned. So it's about, you know, any changes are mutually agreed and cannot be detrimental to the supplier, for instance. This includes also reducing samples, you know, providing accurate tech packs, increasing forecasting accuracy, you know, balancing orders, and so on. Next slide, please. This is the fair payment terms. This is a big one. So the purchasing companies and suppliers agree on a fair and transparent payment terms that include all relevant information regarding the payment procedure and do not place a disproportionate burden on one party. Contractual obligations are honored, and this also includes, of course, ensuring payments are made on time, aiming to improve the timelines of payments, mutually agreeing reasonably penalties, etc. And then last but not least, sustainable costing as the fifth principle. So the costing procedures and levels of the purchasing company reflect and support wage increases and sustainable production. Prices cover all costs of production in line with responsible business conduct and allow for reasonable and maintained supplier profit margin. This includes developing mechanisms to ensure costing and allows for all labor costs. And this is basically aiming and increasing to not only minimum wages, but of course through various mechanisms like collective bargaining that basically at the end of the day supporting the payment of living wages. So since my time is up, so putting the framework into practice, a group of 36 garment brands, retailers from Europe and the UK committed to a 2-year journey. Both CSR and buying teams are participating, and the MSI involved will support the member brands and retailers to achieve meaningful and step-by-step progress, using the framework as a reference point and integrating it into their own implementation system. Of course, with the flexibility in how this is done by different MSIs. And I think to not go too much more into theoretical details, I would suggest that we jump from here straight to Anna. Maybe we can go to the next slide. So if you want to find more about that, there's of course tons of resources available in the net and with our Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. But I think I would suggest I leave it, like looking at time, I leave it here and would hand over to Anna.
Thank you, Sven. Hi, everybody. I'm Anna Rüchert from HACRO. Allow me to say a couple of words about HACRO just very briefly to give you some context in case you haven't heard of us yet. We are a medium-sized corporate wear brand and teamwear brand from Germany. Medium-sized means that we are actually family-run and that there's about 200 employees that are my colleagues here in southern Germany. We also have an NOS business model, so we're not working as a typical fashion industry company would with collections throughout the year, but with a consistent product portfolio that we have on stock, never out of stock is the long-term for NOS. I'm happy to be here today and show you a little bit about how we've been working together with the LIC and what we've learned from it and what we've derived from it according to these 5 principles that Sven has just introduced us to. So if we could go to the first slide, Elsa, please. Thank you. One of the first principles for us as well has been that we need a strong internal collaboration of teams, especially the teams purchasing and sustainability. That really has been key for us at driving this process. The way we are achieving that is by simply making our purchasing team, who are also here today, had the participation in the learning and implementation community, because, and that has, I believe, also been a question in the chat, who would be the best to implement responsible purchasing practices in a brand? It is definitely the purchasing team, because they need to analyze their own practices. They need to get an idea about the impacts they're creating through their practices. And of course, there has to be collaboration also with the sustainability or CR team that are there to help. But that the agency itself should definitely be in the purchasing team. The second very important step is also that there is actively a joint decision-making involving the top management. Now, for us as a family-run company, that is pretty straightforward because our CEO is quite involved still on an operational level as well. But for all of those bigger companies out there where this is probably a little bit less realistic, do invest some time into establishing a direct report with your top management, because that really goes a long way. What we have done, first of all, and you can see that here on the right-hand side, is that we have fully integrated our procurement cycle. For us, even though it might not look that way, this has the benefit that it is a very clear internal process of how things go within our purchasing. It is cross-departmental, and it has integrated all of the principles of corporate responsibility and put the responsible into our purchasing practices, if you wish. So just to give you a rough idea, because this is a very busy graph, on the upper arm of the graph, you see everything that has to do with the development of new products, which is a little bit of an exception for us in our NOS business model, as I tried to explain earlier. You have 4 steps essentially, from supplier selection, either existing or new suppliers, onto the development of the collection, the procurement, the product planning, and then down there, the release and start of production. And throughout all of these very complex steps, things such as common joint capacity planning with our production partner, for instance, or social monitoring according to our impact program audits are directly involved in these processes. Now, what is a bit more everyday for us is what you can see at in the bottom cycle. That is when a product is up and running, and you can also see in the very middle. This is an iterative process where we integrate things such as price adjustments, for instance, depending on market developments. For instance, when wages go up, minimum wages are being raised, like currently in Bangladesh, or also when raw material prices get higher, that we constantly adjust the price to make it fair for everybody. We're still, challenges remain, of course, and we're still struggling a little bit to fully integrate all processes. I want to be honest with you as well, especially downstream. So when it comes to sales and the communication downstream, but also, and we're on that quite intensively, I'll tell you on the next slide, when it comes to everything legal. Principle 2 is about equal partnership. And that for us really is the jumping off point and the foundation of everything we do when we talk about responsible purchasing. What does equal partnership actually mean? For us, it's the attempt to establish a power balance between the buyer, that is us in that scenario, and our production partners. So to really establish a trustful relationship with them, we often use the word co when we try and describe that. So we co-design, we co-price, we co-develop, we co-create, we co-decide together with our production partners. The philosophy or the core intent behind that is really the thinking that my business as Hakro, our business, can only be successful if the business of our production partners is successful and viable. Seems simple, but it's not that easy to be put into practice, of course. All these bullet points I've jotted down here have already been mentioned quite a few times. Long-term partnerships that we do have, our longest are 25 plus years long, actually, do help enormously if you want to invest into joint development, if you want to have long-term progress as well. And especially important is that we don't ever use threats of ditching a partner in order to advance anything within our supply chains. Of course, there has to be a moment where you exit with a partner when absolutely no progress can be made. And then you need to exit responsibly as well, but we never threaten to exit just for the sake of getting things done or pushing for things. What we've also done is we've co-created actually our own Hakro integrated sustainable business strategy together with our production partners. So we've literally had joint workshops. We've asked them for their perspective. We've asked them, what are your business goals for your individual businesses? And we've integrated those into our business strategy, because again, it can only work if we align our strategies together as well. And this sort of two-way dialogue and joint problem solving is something that we generally exercise every day. This has tremendously helped us. I think, Felicia, you've already mentioned it, especially during COVID, for instance, that way of approaching partnerships as something where we support each other to the best of our abilities really has helped us to go through that crisis. We, for instance, didn't have to cancel any orders. We could make sure that we can keep people paid within the supply chains. And I think for that, we really need that trustful and open relationship. When it comes to our purchasing contracts, this is very exciting. We're currently revising them according to the aforementioned SMCs issued by the Responsible Contracting Project. And we're also actively seeking the feedback from our partners before signing the contract. So not just giving them the finished contracts and telling them, well, this is where you're supposed to sign, but actually involving them in their feedback into drafting the contracts themselves. What we don't have yet is a two-way code of conduct. We're currently working on that. This poses a little bit of a challenge because from where our production partner is sitting, their view is that they would have a two-way code of conduct with each and every one of their customers, of which we are one in many cases and only one. So we're currently looking into how we can solve that dilemma a little bit. But going on to principle 3, where it's all about collaborative production planning, we, and that again is due to our NOS business model, surely, are really engaging in long-term planning. What that means is we plan a minimum of 6 months ahead. We also plan on a monthly basis, jointly and together with our production partner, to avoid any short-term changes and to really make sure that the production doesn't ever run idle, or that we don't ever overplan if something should change short-term at the side of the end of our production partners. We are also jointly defining the processes and the internal critical path to really make sure that we have clear timelines, that we avoid domino effects throughout the supply chain if anything is pushed, and that we really avoid time crunches that might then affect, for instance, excessive overtimes or in general just bad working conditions for workers. It all looks fine on paper so far. I also want to be honest. Of course, we sometimes still struggle with having more generous timelines, especially in product development processes, because as I'm sure many of you know, it's nice if you plan it out on the page and then the reality looks slightly different. Sometimes there is 1 or 2 loops required that you haven't anticipated, and then that can of course topple your plan a little bit. So this is something that we haven't fully solved yet. Moving on to principle 4, which is all about fair payment terms. Sven, you said that's the big one, and I think you're quite right. But it also on some level seems blatantly obvious what we can do. We can pay on time. Yes, that's very important. And we can also sometimes look into, and we do offer that to all of our partners, pre-financing of materials. That is especially critical. We do it with very complex products, very expensive products where our partner has to do a lot of purchasing of very expensive materials. It helps to lessen the financial burden of our partner and to share those risks and costs in advance. And it also helps our partner to finance wage payments if we pay on time. So that is something to keep in mind. These fair payment terms are obviously also something we talk about with our partners whilst redrafting our contracts. But I think the most important thing that really clarifies what we mean by an equal partnership as well are the last 2 bullet points on this slide. The fact that we do not have any contractual penalties, for instance, for delivery delays or quality deviations, and that if anything should occur, we are sharing damages. These 2 points really show what the spirit of our partnerships maybe is. It's not about placing blame. It's about developing a common understanding of what may have gone wrong and what the root cause behind that was, and then to see how we can remediate that. So it's really about helping each other out, about co-carrying the business risk, because and thinking about the whole construct that has to make sense, not just the Hakro business, but also the business of our suppliers or production partners. Last but not least, on principle 5, sustainable costing, we've also talked about that. What we do is we do engage in bottom-up costing. So we always ask our production partners, what do you need in order to produce that product and in order to have decent margin and to be able to pay all of your workers? That is a great starting point for any negotiations or any price agreements. What also helps if you co-develop the new products together with your partner, engage with your partner from the get-go, because that also enables all of us at one table to understand the cost impact of single decisions, of single changes, of product components and the like, and also think about the impact that changes may have on workers or specifications in products may have on workers and the processes at the factory from the get-go. Our next step, and I do agree with everyone who has spoken so far, is open costing measures. So really to try and determine the correlation of our product purchasing price and the wage component therein. It is challenging. We haven't fully solved that yet. I think largely because historically, open costing has, by the entire industry, been used to pressure and really exert enormous pressure on production partners to push prices down. So the way we approach it is to really make clear to partners that this is absolutely not our intention. This is not where we're coming from. We really stress what we want to achieve with this for and within our partnership, and to really make them understand and take them along in that process. Sometimes that feels like baby steps, but it's absolutely baby steps that are worth taking. We're starting small with individual products, and to really sort of establish that trustful, carry that trustful relationship also to this topic. Now, I've rushed through this a little bit with regard to the time. If you have any questions, I think we have a little bit of time left for the Q&A, so I'll hand over back to you, Francis. But of course, feel free to contact me afterward as well if anything remains unanswered. Other than that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. Excellent presentation and really insightful and very exciting to see this common framework coming to life and really being employed in practice. I think that's really good stuff, and also really gets to show the value of this framework for companies to actually understand where they stand in terms of purchasing practices. It really guides companies, you know, first of all, in understanding what responsible purchasing practices actually means, and then also how you're doing with regards to these various steps. I think it gets to show the importance of also having the buy-in. There was questions around the responsibility that you already answered. Indeed, it is very much the purchasing department that is in the lead here, but of course, without the buy-in of the CEO, as you so eloquently showed, it's very difficult. And I think that's also one of the success factors in your case, that you have this strong support from your leadership for this, and I think that's a very important takeaway, that C-level buy-in is really crucial, and of course the buy-in of the procurement team, which often follows from the C-level buy-in. But the sustainability departments, that's also one of, well, many of the people that we speak with at Amfori, of course, also purchasing. But I think for the sustainability colleagues, it's also a good tool to actually make the case for responsible purchasing practices, and also having some you know, legislation in place that requires you to do this. Of course, prevention being a critical ask or obligation under the German Supply Chain Act, and any due diligence legislations out there, whether or not they're coming, is of course RPP is critical in this regard. So again, that's another important aspect to highlight. I think one of the tricky bits still is certainly the having these business relationships at eye level, this equal partnership. I think is one of the things that I could also see from the questions, that there seems to be a general tendency that this is not the case, or it's not perceived as such, and that there is many times this issue of business partners being subjected to pressures from their clients, that are kind of feeling that the obligations are just passed on, and that there is a lack of a partnership approach or collaborative approach. So this mutual code of conduct, certainly next frontier that I think you're also still getting to grips with. But really good to see. Thank you so much, Anna. It was super insightful to have this practical example. I didn't see any particular questions now pertaining to this last session, so I decided to just give a bit of a wrap. Now we had one coming in, so that's concretely also to you, Anna. How did you come to terms with your customers? How did they react to the rising prices, to the new pricings and time frame? Interesting to hear how you solved that.
That is a very interesting one. I think at the very start of my presentation, I already said that we haven't fully established integration yet, and that especially downstream and with our sales team, there's a lot of work left to be done. And I think that is definitely one of the most pressing issues there. I think communication is always key, taking people along, making people understand what you want to do. Now, we operate in a B2B environment, and of course the legislative pressure also affects our customers. So they demand us to do our human rights and environmental due diligence increasingly. So that makes it a little bit easier for us to really find common ground for these issues. Of course, it's totally different in a B2C environment. I'm very aware of that, but I think communication really is key. The first step, though, is to actually understand pricing better and to really establish also the gaps that there are still in terms of living wages, for instance, being not paid, and where we have to move our prices in order to reach those living wage levels as well, and to cover by our prices cover the costs our partner has in terms of paying employees. So that is really the first step where we're starting.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much, Anna. We're at the end of the webinar. Thank you all for your insightful questions. We didn't get to answer all of them because there's quite a few, but we will share the recording and the slides. So you will also have all the links and all the materials to kind of dig deeper. Also the contact information of the different speakers. So feel free to also follow up individually if you have questions pertaining to specific guidances or products or use cases. And then, I just quickly give you a last update on upcoming events. So there's the 10th members meeting of the German PST on the 11th of April coming up in Berlin. So the PST members, of course, can participate in that. And then we have our annual event on the 4th and 5th of June in Brussels. The 5th of June is open to stakeholders. The 4th of June is just a members day only in our General Assembly. But we're very much hoping to continue the conversation with all of you there. Also, please stay tuned on our website on any upcoming webinars. We're still in the middle of kind of working out what's next. But there will certainly be more webinars to follow. So thank you also to all our speakers and to all participants, and we speak very soon. Thank you very much.